My dad said men shouldn't cry. Then my little brother made him cry. My dad has always been the kind of man who thinks emotions are a weakness. Real men don't cry. Real men handle their problems. Real men don't talk about feelings. I heard it my entire childhood. And honestly, I stopped expecting anything different from him years ago. When I was 7 and scraped my knee so badly I needed stitches, he told me to stop whimpering in the emergency room. When I was 10 and my pet rabbit died, he said crying over an animal was ridiculous. When I was 14 and didn't make the varsity volleyball team, he called me dramatic for being upset about it. Every single emotional moment of my life came with the same message from him. Suck it up. Move on. Don't let anyone see you break. My little brother Ethan got the same treatment. Maybe worse, actually, because Dad expected even more from his son, the golden child who was supposed to carry on the family name and be tough like him. Last month, my best friend Ashley died. Not in some slow, prepared way where we had time to say goodbye. She had leukemia and was doing well with treatment, and then one Wednesday morning, she just didn't wake up. Complications, the doctor said. Sometimes it happens like that. I found out during first period English when my phone started buzzing with messages from our group chat, and I knew before I even looked. I walked out of class without permission and locked myself in the bathroom, and I cried harder than I ever had in my entire life. These horrible gasping sobs that I couldn't control, like my body was trying to expel the pain physically. My mom picked me up an hour later and held me in the parking lot while I fell apart. When we got home, my dad was in the garage working on his truck. Mom went to tell him what happened, and then he came inside and found me on the couch surrounded by tissues with my eyes so swollen I could barely see. He stood in the doorway for maybe 30 seconds just looking at me. Then he said exactly what I knew he would say. You need to pull yourself together. I know you're upset, but crying isn't going to bring her back. You have to be strong now. His voice wasn't even harsh, just matter of fact, like he was explaining something obvious. Like my best friend dying was just another problem to solve by not having feelings about it. Something inside me snapped right then. I told him I didn't want to be strong. I told him Ashley was dead and I was allowed to be devastated. I told him that pretending everything was fine wouldn't help anything. My voice got louder with every word and I could see his face turning red the way it always did when someone challenged him. He started saying something about how life was going to throw harder things at me than this. But my mom stepped between us and told him very quietly that if he couldn't be supportive, he needed to leave. They stared at each other for a few seconds. Then he shook his head and walked back to the garage. I heard his truck start up and he didn't come home until late that night. The funeral was Saturday. Ashley's mom asked me to speak, to share memories on behalf of our friend group. I'd written something the night before, crying over the paper as I tried to find words that could possibly capture what she meant to me. Standing up there looking at her casket with photos all around it, I barely made it through. My voice kept breaking and I had to stop multiple times just to breathe. But I got through it, and afterward her mom hugged me so tight and thanked me for loving her daughter. When we got home that night, I went straight to my room and didn't come out. I couldn't face whatever emotionless comment my dad would make. For the next week, he basically avoided me. He couldn't handle being around my grief, so he just pretended I didn't exist. His typical coping mechanism for anything emotionally uncomfortable. My mom kept checking on me, but Dad acted like nothing had happened at all. The following Friday night, Ethan knocked on my door around 8. He sat on my bed looking nervous and asked how I was doing. I gave him the automatic fine that I'd been giving everyone, but he didn't look convinced. Then he said something that surprised me. He told me he'd been having nightmares about death, waking up scared that something would happen to me or Mom. And every time he tried talking to Dad about being scared, Dad would tell him to toughen up and not worry about things he couldn't control. Ethan said he felt like something was wrong with him for being so affected by this, like he was failing at being the strong son Dad wanted. My heart broke hearing that. I pulled him into a hug and told him there was nothing wrong with him. I explained that having feelings was completely normal and healthy, and that Dad's way of handling emotions wasn't the only way, or even a good way. I told him about my own struggles, how some days I could barely get out of bed, but talking about it and letting myself cry was actually helping me process everything. Ethan listened and then asked me this question I'll never forget. Do you think Dad ever gets sad about things but just hides it really well? Or do you think he actually doesn't feel things the way we do? I didn't know how to answer because I genuinely wasn't sure. Our dad was such a closed book that I had no idea what was actually going on inside him. The next afternoon, Ethan had a baseball game, one of the last of the season, and Dad had been talking about it all week because scouts from the high school team would be there. Mom convinced me to come, saying it might be good to get out of the house. We sat in the bleachers while Ethan warmed up, and I could see Dad was tense, watching his every move with intense focus. The game started with Ethan pitching, which was his best position. First few innings went great and his team was winning. Dad was relaxed and actually smiling. But in the fourth inning, everything went wrong. Ethan threw a pitch that got hit hard, a line drive screaming back toward the mound. He tried to catch it, but the ball hit him directly in the face before his glove came up. The impact sound was sickening. Ethan dropped immediately and everyone in the stands gasped and stood up. Dad was over the fence and running before the coaches even moved. I was right behind him with Mom, my heart pounding. When we reached Ethan, there was blood everywhere. His nose was clearly broken, maybe his cheekbone too. He was conscious but dazed, and he started crying the moment he saw us. Not just from pain, but from fear and shock and probably embarrassment. The coaches called an ambulance and Dad knelt next to him, trying to assess the damage. That's when Ethan said something that made my stomach drop. He looked right at Dad through his tears and said, "I'm sorry for crying. I'm trying to be strong like you want. I'm sorry I'm being weak right now." His voice was so small and broken, apologizing for having a completely normal reaction to getting hit in the face with a baseball. I watched my dad's face change in that moment. Something shifted in his expression that I'd never seen before. The ambulance arrived and they loaded Ethan onto a stretcher. Dad rode with him while Mom and I followed in the car. At the hospital, they confirmed his nose was broken and he had a fractured cheekbone. They had to reset his nose right there, which meant essentially re-breaking it to set it properly. The doctor explained the procedure and asked if we wanted to wait outside, but Ethan grabbed Dad's hand and asked him to stay. They gave Ethan something for the pain, but he'd still feel pressure and discomfort. I watched from the doorway as the doctor worked, and I watched my dad holding Ethan's hand, while Ethan squeezed his eyes shut and tears ran down his face. Dad kept saying, "It's okay. You're doing great. Almost done now." His voice was shaking slightly, which I'd never heard before. When it was finally over, Ethan was exhausted, and his face was so swollen he looked like a different person. They wanted to keep him overnight for observation because of the head injury. Mom went to fill out paperwork and I stayed in the room with Ethan and Dad. Ethan had fallen asleep from the pain medication, and Dad sat in the chair next to the bed just staring at him. I was about to leave and give him space when he started talking. He didn't look at me, just kept his eyes on Ethan, but he started telling me things I'd never heard before. He said when he was Ethan's age, his own father used to hit him for crying. Not just yell at him or tell him to toughen up, but actually hit him across the face if he showed emotion. Dad said he learned early that feelings got you hurt, so he buried everything as deep as it would go. He thought he was protecting us by teaching us not to cry, preparing us for a world that wouldn't care about our pain. But watching Ethan apologize for crying while his face was broken made him realize he'd been doing the exact same thing his father did, just without the physical violence. He was teaching us that our emotions made us weak, that we couldn't trust him with our real feelings, and that was destroying his relationship with both of us. His voice cracked when he said that last part, and I looked at him in shock. My dad, who I'd never seen show a single emotion beyond anger, was sitting there with tears running down his face. He finally looked at me and said he was sorry. Sorry for every time he dismissed my pain. Sorry for making me feel like I had to hide who I was. Sorry for not being there when Ashley died. He said he didn't know how to be different, but he wanted to try, because losing his relationship with his kids wasn't worth maintaining some image of strength that was really just fear. I sat there completely frozen, because I genuinely didn't know what to say. This was the dad I'd spent 16 years wishing I had, suddenly appearing in a hospital room after my brother got hit in the face with a baseball. It felt surreal, but I could see he meant it. This wasn't some performative moment. He was genuinely breaking down the walls he'd spent decades building. Mom came back and saw Dad crying and immediately asked what was wrong. Dad just shook his head and said he was fine, then caught himself and laughed this weird broken laugh. He said, "Actually, no, I'm not fine." Our son apologized for crying while his face was broken because I taught him emotions are weakness. And our daughter lost her best friend and I told her to get over it. I'm not fine at all. Mom sat down on his other side and put her hand on his shoulder, and the three of us just sat there in the hospital room while Ethan slept. Dad kept wiping his eyes and apologizing for crying, which was almost funny in a sad way. He was doing the exact thing he'd always told us not to do, and he couldn't even stop himself from apologizing for it. I told him he didn't need to apologize, that this was actually the most human I'd ever seen him, and I preferred this version. He looked at me like I'd said something profound, but really I was just being honest. When Ethan woke up a few hours later, the first thing he saw was Dad's red, swollen eyes. Ethan's face was so messed up he could barely talk, but he managed to ask if Dad was okay. Dad laughed and said he'd been asking himself the same question, and realizing the answer was no, he hadn't been okay for a very long time. He told Ethan he was sorry for making him think crying was wrong, that he was proud of him for being sensitive and caring about people, that being able to feel things deeply wasn't weakness, it was actually the strongest thing a person could do. Ethan just stared at him confused, probably wondering if the pain medication was making him hallucinate, because this was not the father we knew. I couldn't help smiling a little because after 16 years, my dad was finally becoming someone we could actually talk to. It had taken my best friend dying and my brother getting seriously injured, but something had finally broken through. They released Ethan the next morning with instructions for care and follow-up appointments. His face looked terrible, both eyes black and his nose wrapped in bandages. Dad insisted on carrying all his stuff and helping him to the car, even though Ethan said he could walk fine. When we got home, Dad set Ethan up on the couch with pillows and blankets and ice packs. He brought him water and medication and kept asking if he needed anything else. Mom and I exchanged looks because this was extremely out of character. Dad never doted on anyone or showed this kind of care. He was always the tough love parent who expected you to handle things yourself. But something had fundamentally shifted in him during those hours at the hospital. That night, our family group chat that had been mostly dead for months suddenly got active. Dad sent a long message saying he wanted to have family dinners again and actually talk to each other about real things, not just surface-level stuff. He said he knew he'd been distant and emotionally unavailable, and he wanted to work on being more present. The first family dinner was awkward as hell. I'm not going to lie. We sat around the table and nobody really knew what to say because we weren't used to this. Dad asked me about school and actually listened to my answer instead of just nodding and going back to his phone. He asked about my friends and how I was coping with Ashley's death. I gave him honest answers and he didn't tell me to move on or be strong. He just said he was sorry and asked what he could do to help. It was weird having a dad who actually engaged with my life. Ethan was still pretty out of it from pain medication, but Dad asked him about his classes and his friends and his plans for high school next year. Real questions that showed he cared about more than just baseball stats. Mom sat there watching all of this with this expression I couldn't quite read. like she was cautiously optimistic but also waiting for the other shoe to drop. I think we were all kind of waiting for Dad to snap back to his old self, but he didn't. Over the next few weeks, he kept showing up differently. When I had a bad day and came home upset about something, he didn't tell me to toughen up. He asked what happened and if I wanted to talk about it. When Ethan got nervous about going back to baseball after his injury, Dad sat with him and acknowledged that fear was normal and they could work through it together. He started coming to my volleyball games, which he'd never done before. He'd sit in the stands and actually cheer instead of just being on his phone the whole time. After one game where we lost badly and I played terribly, I was dreading the car ride home. But instead of criticizing my performance like I expected, he said he was proud of me for trying hard even when things weren't going well. I almost crashed the car from shock. This new version of my dad was going to take some getting used to. The really big moment came about a month after the accident. We were having another family dinner, and Dad brought up something I never expected him to discuss. He said he'd started seeing a therapist to work through his issues with emotional expression and the trauma from his own childhood. He told us his father had been abusive, not just with the hitting, but with constant verbal attacks that made him believe showing any weakness would get him hurt. He'd carried that belief into adulthood and passed it down to us without even realizing it. But he was working on unlearning those patterns now because he didn't want to damage us the way his father had damaged him. Hearing my dad talk about therapy and trauma and patterns of abuse was surreal. This was the man who'd always said therapy was for weak people who couldn't handle their problems. Now he was sitting at our dinner table being vulnerable and honest about his struggles. Ethan's face had healed pretty well by then, though his nose had a slight bump now that would probably be permanent. He told Dad he was proud of him for getting help, and I watched my dad's eyes get watery again. He was still not great at handling his emotions, but at least now he was letting himself have them. He thanked Ethan and said that moment in the hospital when Ethan apologized for crying had broken something open in him that had been locked away for decades. He realized he was turning his son into the same emotionally repressed person he'd become, and he couldn't let that happen. It was one of the most honest conversations we'd ever had as a family. Mom reached across the table and squeezed Dad's hand, and I saw tears in her eyes too. I think she'd been waiting years for him to deal with his issues, and she was relieved it was finally happening. School started back up after fall break, and I was still struggling with Ashley's absence. Her locker was right next to mine, and every morning I'd see it and feel this wave of sadness. Our friend group had kind of fractured after her death, everyone dealing with grief in different ways. Some people threw themselves into activities, some withdrew completely. I was somewhere in the middle, going through the motions but not really present. One particularly bad morning, I just stood in front of her locker and started crying in the middle of the hallway. Other students walked past staring at me, but I couldn't stop. My phone rang and it was Dad, which was unusual because he never called me at school. He asked if I was okay because he had this feeling something was wrong. I told him where I was and what was happening, and he said he'd be there in 10 minutes. I went outside to wait for him, and true to his word, he pulled up exactly 10 minutes later. He didn't make me explain or ask a bunch of questions. He just said, "Get in the car, we're taking a mental health day." We drove to this diner we used to go to when I was little, and he bought me pancakes and hot chocolate. Then he said I could talk if I wanted to, or we could just sit there, whatever I needed. I ended up telling him everything. How I felt like I was drowning in sadness some days, and how guilty I felt when I had good days because Ashley would never have another good day. How I was mad at myself for not spending more time with her when she was sick, even though I'd visited every weekend. How I was terrified of losing anyone else I loved and it was making me push people away. Dad listened to everything without interrupting, and when I finished, he shared something with me I'd never known. He told me his younger sister had died when he was 17, a car accident, and he'd never properly dealt with that grief. He just buried it and moved on because that's what his father told him to do, and it had haunted him his entire life. He said watching me grieve Ashley openly and honestly was teaching him that maybe he needed to finally process his sister's death too. That maybe if he'd let himself feel that pain back then, he wouldn't have become so emotionally closed off. We sat in that diner for 3 hours just talking about loss and grief and how hard it is to keep living when someone you love is gone. It was the first real conversation I'd ever had with my dad where he treated me like an equal instead of a child who needed correction. When we finally went home, Mom asked where we'd been, and Dad explained about the mental health day. Instead of being mad that he'd pulled me out of school, she hugged both of us. She said she was glad we were finally connecting and that she'd been hoping for this for years. That night, I posted on social media about taking a mental health day with my dad, and the responses were wild. Some people said I was lucky to have a parent who understood that. Others said their parents would never. A few people criticized me for skipping school, but whatever. Ethan's first baseball game after his injury was nerve-wracking for all of us, but especially for Dad. I could see him tense up every time a ball came near Ethan, his hands gripping the bleachers so hard his knuckles went white. But Ethan played great, more careful than before but still confident. After the game, Dad pulled him aside and I watched them talk. Later, Ethan told me Dad had apologized for putting so much pressure on him over the years, for making baseball feel like it was about pleasing him instead of just having fun. Dad said he was proud of Ethan no matter what he did, whether that was sports or art or literally anything else. Ethan said it was the first time Dad had ever told him he was proud of him just for being himself. That conversation apparently meant everything to him. Over the next few months, I watched my brother become more confident and open. He started trying new things without worrying about whether Dad would approve, and Dad encouraged all of it. The holidays came and went with our family in this weird new dynamic that was still being figured out. Dad still had moments where he'd slip back into old patterns, telling us to toughen up or dismissing emotions. But now when he did it, he'd catch himself and apologize. He'd say, "Sorry, that was my father talking, not me. Let me try that again." And then he'd respond in a healthier way. It was clear he was really working on changing, even though it was hard, and he didn't always get it right. Mom told me privately that Dad's therapist said he was making remarkable progress for someone who'd spent 50 years suppressing every feeling. She said she was falling in love with him all over again, seeing the person he could have been if his father hadn't broken him. I was happy for both of them, and honestly happy for our whole family. We were becoming people who could actually be honest with each other instead of performing roles we thought we were supposed to play. One night in January, about 4 months after Ethan's accident, we were having dinner when Ethan brought up something unexpected. He said one of his friends had come out as gay, and some kids at school were giving him a hard time about it. Ethan asked what we thought about it, and I could see him watching Dad nervously. In the past, Dad had made comments about that kind of thing being wrong or unnatural, typical toxic masculinity nonsense. But now he paused and thought about his answer. Then he said he thought it was brave of Ethan's friend to be honest about who he was, and that anyone giving him a hard time was dealing with their own insecurities. He said people should be allowed to love who they love and be who they are without judgment. Ethan's face lit up with relief, and I realized he'd been testing Dad to see if the changes were real. Dad must have realized it too because he added that he knew he'd said some ignorant things in the past, but he was learning to be better. After dinner, Ethan pulled me aside and told me something that made me cry. He said he'd been struggling with his own sexuality for the past year, not sure if he was gay or bi or what, and he'd been terrified to tell anyone because of how Dad used to talk about it. But now, seeing Dad's response to his friend coming out, he felt like maybe it would be okay to be honest about himself too. I hugged him and told him I loved him no matter what and I'd support him whenever he was ready to come out to the family. He said he wasn't quite ready yet, but knowing I had his back made him feel less alone. I told him we should tell Mom soon because she'd be supportive too, and together we could help prepare Dad if needed. Even though Dad was changing, we didn't know how he'd handle his own son being queer. That was a different level of personal that might trigger his old beliefs. We ended up telling Mom the following week, and she reacted exactly how I knew she would. She hugged Ethan and told him she loved him unconditionally and thanked him for trusting her with this. Then she said we needed to think carefully about when and how to tell Dad, because even though he was making progress, this would be a real test of how far he'd come. She suggested maybe Ethan could talk to Dad's therapist first, get some professional advice on the best approach. Ethan liked that idea, and Mom arranged it. A few days later, Ethan had a session with Dad's therapist, and she helped him plan out what he wanted to say. She also apparently talked to Dad separately about being open-minded and supportive if any of his kids ever came to him with something important. I don't know what exactly she said, but I'm guessing she was laying groundwork. The conversation happened on a random Thursday evening in February. Ethan asked if we could have a family meeting, which immediately made everyone nervous because we only did those for serious stuff. We sat in the living room and Ethan looked like he might throw up from anxiety. Dad kept asking if something was wrong, if Ethan was in trouble or hurt. Finally, Ethan just said it. I'm gay, or maybe bisexual. I'm still figuring it out. But I like boys and I needed you all to know. The room went completely silent. Mom immediately said she loved him and moved to hug him. I did the same. But Dad just sat there staring at nothing, processing. Ethan was watching him with this expression of absolute terror, waiting for rejection or anger or disappointment. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then Dad stood up, walked over to Ethan, and pulled him into the tightest hug I'd ever seen him give anyone. He said, "I love you. Nothing you could tell me would change that. I'm proud of you for being honest." His voice was shaking, and when they finally pulled apart, Dad had tears running down his face again. He apologized for every homophobic thing he'd ever said in Ethan's presence, for creating an environment where Ethan felt scared to be himself. He said he was still learning and would probably mess up sometimes, but he was committed to supporting Ethan completely. Ethan started crying too, these relieved sobs like he'd been holding his breath for years and could finally breathe. Mom and I were both crying at that point too, and we all just ended up in this big group hug in the middle of the living room. It was one of those moments that rewrites everything you thought you knew about your family. Dad was really genuinely changing into someone capable of unconditional love and acceptance. That night after Ethan went to bed, Dad came to my room and asked if we could talk. He sat on my desk chair looking exhausted but peaceful somehow. He said Ethan coming out had made him realize how close he'd come to losing both his kids by being so rigid and closed off, that if he'd kept going the way he was, Ethan never would have felt safe telling him the truth, and I would have kept him at arm's length forever. He said the work he was doing in therapy was hard and painful, but seeing moments like tonight made it worth it. He was discovering parts of himself he'd buried so deep he forgot they existed. The part that could feel joy and sadness and love without fear. The part that could connect with his kids as real people. He thanked me for being patient with him while he figured out how to be a better father. I told him I was proud of him too, which made him tear up again. This new dad who cried openly was still strange to me, but in a good way. The next few months were probably the healthiest our family had ever been. Dad continued therapy and started reading books about emotional intelligence and unlearning toxic masculinity. He joined this men's group at the local community center where guys talked about their feelings and supported each other through life challenges. He said at first it felt ridiculous, but now it was one of the most valuable things he did. He'd come home from those meetings and share what he'd learned, how many other men were struggling with the same issues he had, how they'd all been taught that emotions were weakness and real men suffered in silence, and how that belief was destroying them and their families. He said one guy in the group had lost his marriage because he couldn't communicate emotionally. Another guy's son had attempted suicide, and he'd had no idea his kid was struggling because they'd never learned how to really talk to each other. Hearing these stories made Dad even more committed to changing. He didn't want to be another cautionary tale of a man who lost everything because he couldn't admit he had feelings. He started doing little things that seemed insignificant but meant everything. He'd text me during the day to ask how I was doing. He'd have actual conversations with Ethan about his life beyond just baseball. He'd thank Mom for specific things instead of taking her for granted. He'd tell us all he loved us before bed, which he'd literally never done before in my entire life. These small, consistent actions added up to a completely different relationship. I actually wanted to spend time with him now instead of avoiding him. Ethan started going to him for advice about school and friends and dating. Mom said their marriage felt new again, like they were rediscovering each other after years of emotional distance. In April, our school did this thing for Mental Health Awareness Month where students could share their stories. I decided to talk about grief and losing Ashley, but also about my dad's journey, and how watching him learn to express emotions had helped me deal with my own. I didn't use his name or specific details, but I talked about growing up in a house where feelings weren't allowed, and how damaging that was, how it made me bury my pain until it became unbearable, and how seeing an adult finally break down those walls and become vulnerable had given me permission to do the same. The response was overwhelming. So many students came up to me afterward saying they related that their parents were the same way. Teachers thanked me for being brave enough to talk about it. Someone recorded it and posted it online, and it ended up going viral on TikTok of all places. Suddenly, thousands of people were commenting about their own experiences with emotionally unavailable parents. Dad saw the video because someone from his men's group showed it to him. He called me that night, and I thought he was going to be mad that I'd shared family stuff publicly. But instead, he said he was proud of me for using my experience to help other people. He said if my story could help even one kid feel less alone, or one parent realize they needed to change, then it was worth any embarrassment he might feel. That response right there showed how far he'd come. The old dad would have been furious about me airing family business. This new dad understood that sharing our struggles could help others. He even asked if I'd be okay with him sharing his own story in his men's group about what had changed for him. I told him absolutely, and he should share it wherever he thought it might help someone. A few weeks later, he told me he'd shared it, and multiple guys had thanked him and said they were going to try therapy too. One guy said my dad's story had literally saved his relationship with his teenage daughter. By summer, our family felt unrecognizable from what it had been a year ago. We actually talked to each other about real things. We shared our feelings without fear of judgment. We supported each other through hard times instead of everyone suffering alone. Dad had become someone I could go to with any problem, knowing he'd listen and try to help instead of just telling me to deal with it. Ethan was openly dating a boy from his class, and Dad had even met him and been completely normal about it. Mom was happier than I'd seen her in years. Lighter somehow, like she'd been carrying a weight that finally got lifted. We still had problems, obviously. We weren't perfect, but we were functional and honest with each other, which felt revolutionary for our family. And it all started because my little brother got hit in the face with a baseball and apologized for crying, which finally broke through my dad's armor and made him realize what he was doing to us. Looking back now, I think about how different things could have been. If Ethan hadn't gotten hurt that specific way at that specific moment when Dad was already rattled from Ashley's death and my grief. If Ethan hadn't said those exact words that hit Dad so personally. If Dad had just doubled down on his beliefs instead of letting them crack. We could have ended up as another family that slowly drifted apart as the kids grew up and moved away, maintaining polite surface-level relationships but never really knowing each other. Instead, we got this second chance to build something real. It's still weird sometimes, having a dad who asks about my feelings and actually cares about the answer, having a dad who tells me he loves me and shows up for the things that matter to me. But it's a good kind of weird, the kind where you're grateful for something you didn't know you could have. Ethan told me recently that he barely remembers the old version of Dad anymore. He said this current version is just who Dad is now in his mind, and the emotionally unavailable guy from before feels like a different person. I'm not quite there yet because I have 16 years of memories with old Dad versus less than a year with new Dad. But I'm getting there. Every positive interaction writes over an old negative one, slowly replacing the database of who my father is in my head. Maybe someday I'll think of him as the dad who showed up, who changed, who loved us enough to do the hard work of becoming better. That's the dad I want to remember. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.